This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome, everyone, back to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. Before we dive into the fascinating material today, talking about DOGE and taxpayer dividend checks, and is that going to be inflationary? That's the stuff we're going to be talking about. Let me first remind you that you can join the Mises Institute on April 26th in Phoenix, Arizona, as we expose the danger and waste of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is both a weapon and a weakness for the modern state. While it regulates, spies on, and controls almost every aspect of our lives, it's impeded by its own incompetence and waste. As Mises warned in his book, Bureaucracy, quote, "The ultimate basis of an all-around bureaucratic system is violence." And as Murray Rothbard said, what bureaucrats and power elites always want is for the opposition to shut up and go away, to obey orders, to accept their assigned tasks. Well, we don't plan to shut up or go away. So join Dr. Robert Malone, Tom Woods, and Tom DiLorenzo as they discuss the psychological operations in bureaucratic control, the madness of COVID-era public health, and the corruption and hypocrisy of our federal bureaucracy. Tickets are $100 for Mises members and $120 for non-members. Register now at Mises.org/Phoenix25. That's Mises.org/Phoenix25. And also, here's your chance to win a free ticket. Enter the raffle at Mises.org/PhoenixRaffle25 by April 1st. Winners will be announced the week of April 7th. Hope you can make it. Okay, so what I want to talk about in this episode, folks, as I'm sure many of you know, the so-called DOGE crew, the Department of Governmental Efficiency that's headed up by Elon Musk, they have been going through the various agencies of the federal government and spending programs and slashing and burning, according to the critics, or rooting out ridiculous examples of government waste and fraud and abuse, according to the supporters of it. And I don't know where this originated from, if somebody else on the outside said it or if Elon or one of his team members brought it up. But the proposal now is making the rounds as I'm recording this, as to say, hey, instead of just having these spending cuts reduce government expenditures for this next fiscal year, what if instead we gave a dividend check, a rebate to the taxpayers? And so I want to be clear, the versions of the proposal that I've seen are saying this is not just a lump sum check that's sent to every American or every citizen. It's instead only going to be sent to people who are net taxpayers, right? So it's the spirit of it is this is not a stimulus check. Instead, it is passing along the savings on the spending side that the DOGE team has identified and giving at least some of that back to the taxpayers who are the ones ultimately funding all this crazy stuff, right? So that's the idea. So interestingly, and I applaud their consistent, well, as we're going to see, I actually think that they're making a mistake in their argument, but I applaud them wanting to be consistent and principled about it. There were a lot of conservative/libertarian fans of DOGE and what it's doing in terms of cutting spending who are saying, no, don't send out checks to everybody. And the number would be about $5,000 was the number that I saw floating around. They said, no, don't send people $5,000 checks. Isn't that exactly what the government did under COVID? That regime, when they were sending out the so-called stimulus checks, or stimmies, as people called them colloquially. And it hasn't our whole narrative been that that's what helped fuel CPI inflation. And so aren't we being hypocrites? Aren't we doing the exact same thing? And in fact, I've seen several people on social media coming forward and saying, hey, I don't want my check. And then some of us were joking and saying, okay, well, we'll take your check. All right. So that's what I want to cover today. That whole, in terms of the particulars of what we are right now, where we are right now with the boots on the ground in this particular episode, but then pulling back and just talking more generally about what causes consumer price inflation. And so let me even just elaborate on that little point that I made right there. I'm going to try to be a stickler about this in this episode, but in case I get lazy and just take a shortcut, I want to make sure you're not getting lost. In the general parlance, when people say inflation, they really mean rising prices. And actually, if you get more specific, they mean rising consumer prices, right? So what I'm calling CPI is consumer price index. So that's the version that the government publishes, take it or leave it. as to how accurate you think it is, but that's what that's categorizing. And in case you're not understanding the distinction, if the stock market goes up 12% in a year, while eggs and gasoline and butter and cereal stay roughly the same price, nobody would be running around complaining about, oh wow, inflation's out of control. Even though technically the stock market, when you say the stock market goes up 10% or 12%, whatever number I said, you're referring to the price of units of stock, shares of stock, that price, whatever it is, if they go up a certain percentage and then you put it into an average, if the S&P 500 or Dow Jones, whatever it is you're talking about, that's what it means to say the stock market went up, is the price of buying this basket of stocks went up. All right. So, or another example, if home prices go up 15% in a year, there might be people complaining about affordability and so, but people would not be running around talking about inflation is bad this year, right? And the reason for that intuitively is that stocks and houses are assets that are owned by people, and so when the price goes up, they like that, oh, my asset is appreciating. That's partly why they bought it, is because they wanted the purchase price of this asset to rise over time. They would be alarmed if it didn't. They would really be alarmed if those prices went down, right? If the stock market crashes, that's, hey, things got cheaper. Isn't that good? Now you can get Google stock at a lower price, but that's not how that would be interpreted if the stock market goes down 10% in a day. People would freak out. Okay, so anyway, this is probably obvious stuff to many of you, but I don't see people often spelling this out, so I just wanted to say it. And we have some younger listeners too, so they understand how the world works. All right, so anyway, back to the point. When people in general complain about or warn about inflation nowadays, what they actually mean is rising prices of certain consumer goods like eggs and gasoline, stuff like that. Okay. In the Austrian tradition, though, this is something that Ludwig von Mises stressed. They hearkened back to the original usage of the term. So originally, inflation referred to an expansion in the stock of money and or credit. And so the idea was the authorities or the banking system, broadly construed, could inflate the money supply, again, including, bank credit in that, depending on the definition of the money supply that you're using. And then that ultimately would probably tend to push up prices. It certainly would push up prices relative to the counterfactual when the money supply wasn't inflated. All right. So if, in other words, suppose the money stock stayed the same, and then that would mean in that scenario that consumer prices would tend to fall by 2% a year. Then if the money stock is boosted 4% a year, maybe you observe consumer prices rising 2%. Okay, so there's those sorts of possible interactions. Or it could just be a perfect wash where suppose consumer prices would normally fall 2%, they inflate the money supply 2% a year, and so then the consumer price index is flat. In that kind of a scenario, you could say, oh, there's monetary inflation, but no consumer price inflation in terms of the observable level. But still, you would say, oh, no, but the monetary inflation still is causing consumer price inflation relative to what otherwise would have occurred. Okay, so there's those sort of subtleties when you get into it. And you got to just be careful about what are we talking about. If we say, hey, they printed a bunch of money and prices didn't go up, well, would prices have otherwise collapsed? In which case, okay, so you get the idea. So to avoid confusion, what I try to do especially if I'm speaking to the public, is just distinguish, and I'll use an adjective. So I'll refer to either monetary inflation or price inflation. And then sometimes I'll get really specific and say consumer price inflation. Because again, as we've seen, when people worry about price inflation, they don't mean all prices. They usually mean a particular subset of prices about things that the household needs for daily living. And even there, like apartment rent or shelter services, the price of that could be included in many cost of living indices, but the purchase price of a house typically would not be. Okay, even though there's a sense in which, well, gee, if I buy a house, isn't that like the capitalized flow of all future shelter services that it provides? But anyway, so I'm just explaining, even though, yes, part of what it means to say, what's the cost of living? Like if I move to the big city, the cost of living is higher. And that's partly reflected in the fact that, oh yeah, just to get a 1-bedroom apartment is going to really cost you a lot. In certain indices, the higher rent would be included in the, consumer price index or cost of living index. But I'm saying the capitalized value of the apartment building itself, or what would it cost you if you wanted to buy the apartment outright from the landlord? That typically would not be in any of these measures, even though, the monthly rental price would be. Okay, so back to the specifics of the DOGE controversy. Let me just give some ballpark numbers to make this a little bit more realistic, and just so we get our hands around, the real world numbers here. So I'm rounding off, but big picture ballpark for 2025, on the original trajectory, the federal government was going to spend about $7 trillion, and it was going to take in receipts, from various types of taxes and other, duties they have and royalty payments on their mineral resources and stuff like that, about $5 trillion. Okay. So again, these are big ballpark numbers. I'm rounding to the nearest trillion, which is what you can do when it's good enough for government work. Okay. So left to its own devices, the federal government was going to have a $2 trillion deficit this year. All right. Because it was going to spend $7 trillion, only taking $5 trillion in revenue or receipts. And so the $2 trillion gap, that would be the deficit. And so what would happen is the Treasury would have to issue $2 trillion in additional Treasury securities, borrowing from the outside world, including, U.S. citizens, in order to bring in that extra $2 trillion to cover the planned $7 trillion in expenditures. Okay. And so the federal debt would rise by $2 trillion. Okay, since I'm doing basic accounting and things like that here, why don't I just say that too, in case you're wondering what's the difference between the deficit and the debt? The deficit refers to the flow over a given period, typically a year, whereas the debt is a stock, right? So deficit's a flow concept, debt is a stock. The debt just says at any snapshot point in time, what's the total outstanding debt, whereas the deficit's saying over a certain period, like a year, what is the mismatch? How much more is the government spending than they're taking in receipts? And that mismatch over that period is the deficit, like the annual deficit. Okay, so one way of thinking about it is if you went back in time to the beginning when the debt was zero, and then you added up all of the deficits going forward, then at the end of that process, the snapshot value of what's the debt right now would equal the sum of all those things. Okay. All right. So now DOGE comes along. They identify all sorts of programs that they want to cancel. And so let's say that adds up to $500 billion. Now, incidentally, I have seen critics vetting DOGE's reported savings, and apparently, on at least some of them, the analysts just got it wrong. I think partly what happened is they might have like an AI system that goes in and looks at the government contract and then scrapes out, like how much was this, how much were they going to spend, and then puts it in a database, and then they were reporting that. And so the critics went through that, and they found some examples where there was a contract of, I think it was like $8 million, but the DOGE database was reporting that as a savings of $8 billion. Okay, so there were some discrepancies like that, and I didn't see anybody from the DOGE team push back on that claim to say, no, you guys misunderstood. So prima facie, from what I've seen, it looks like, there are at least a few examples of that where the DOGE team, I guess they have like a website saying, hey, if you want to go through and see what we've saved you taxpayers already, here you go. And the critics who don't like those guys have gone in and found at least a few examples where it looks like they misreported, they inflated the savings because or there are other cases too where like the contract was listing how much they had the authority to spend over a given period of time, but so far they'd only spent a certain amount. Or the other way around, they had already spent a lot of it, and then on the contract there was only 20% left that still needed to be expended. So canceling that right now would not save taxpayers the entire original appropriation. It would just save that last 20%, right? So there were some things like that where if you weren't a government bureaucrat with years of experience in these things and you just came in, you might misunderstand what these contracts were saying. And so that's what the critics are alleging. All right. So with this stuff, I am not here endorsing the idea that DOGE actually has identified or will identify $500 billion in savings. I mean, they could. I hope they do. Hope they do more. But I'm just explaining that, let's just take this number as a nice round one for the purposes of our numerical example here. Okay, so suppose the DOGE team identifies $500 billion in spending that would have occurred in calendar 2025. That's part of the issue, too, is there's a mismatch between the fiscal year and the calendar year. But just to keep it easy, let's assume we're talking about the calendar year 2025, right? So normally there would have been $7 trillion in spending, $5 trillion in taxes, a $2 trillion deficit. DOGE now comes on the scene. They look at a bunch of planned spending and they say, no, that's crazy. Cancel. Not you. You're okay. You're cool. Not you, right? They're doing that. And let's say when they're done with that process, they have identified $500 billion worth of spending that would have occurred in 2025, but now is not going to. And so now the question is, what do we do about that? All right. So if they did nothing, if all they did was refrain from spending the $500 billion that they otherwise planned on spending, then instead of the expenditures being $7 trillion, they would be $6.5 trillion, right? And so then the deficit for 2025 would fall. Instead of it being the original $2 trillion, it would drop to $1.5 trillion. Okay. And so that's what a lot of people mean when they say, DOGE, no, just keep the, for the spending cuts you're identifying, just do that. And then that will reduce the deficit. That's what those people mean. What I just said. So the deficit otherwise would have been $2 trillion. Now, if they find $500 billion in savings, then the deficit falls to $1.5 trillion. Okay. So there's that. But now the question is, well, what would happen if instead the DOGE team, because of their spending cuts now, they push through a rebate dividend check to taxpayers of $5,000 per household, and let's say there's 100 million, units or households, whatever you want to call it, receiving these $5,000 payments. Okay, so 5,000 times 100 million is 500 billion. Okay, so the idea is what would happen in that scenario. So the deficit would once again be $2 trillion, right? And so that's the people worrying about, hey, isn't this going to boost the deficit and then cause inflation like we saw, consumer price inflation like we saw with the COVID checks? I want to say no. Even if you thought it was deficit spending per se that caused price inflation, all right? And we're going to come to that claim or that step in the argument in a moment. But let me defer that discussion. All right. But I just want to warn you, I'm going to challenge that too and say it's more nuanced than that simple claim. But my point is, even if what you thought happened during the COVID era was, oh yeah, the government sent out a bunch of stimulus checks to everybody that made the deficit really big. And then that extra deficit spending caused, or at least was a big factor in, perhaps coupled with the supply bottlenecks, blah, 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 this, 40-year high surge in consumer price inflation, right? This is the worst consumer price inflation we've seen since the early 80s, even according to the government's own numbers. All right. And some people would think it was even worse because the government, does tricks to hide what the actual jump in CPI is. Okay. So, no, the important difference, and this is what many of the defenders of the proposal were saying, so I just want to, endorse their perspective because I think it's correct, is they were saying, no, there is a qualitative difference between these two episodes. In the COVID era, total government spending went way up. You can go look at it, right? So the idea is whatever they thought total government spending was going to be in the year 2020 and 2021, as of 2019, the actual spending was way higher in those years once, the COVID hysteria kicked in. All right, so the government spent a lot more, and yes, the deficit was bigger. And that's why, because the tax receipts, didn't go way up. In fact, depending on the time period, they probably went down because fewer people were working. And this actual flow of spending was a lot higher than it would have been in a normal timeline, absent the COVID hysteria, right? Here, what's happening is let's say that, the $5,000 rebate checks go through, government spending is not higher than it otherwise would have been, right? And here it depends on how you classify it. I would argue government spending is actually lower, right? Because the people who are pushing this, what they're saying, they're not saying, let's spend some more money. Let's spend an extra $5,000 for certain people. No, they're viewing it as a rebate to the taxpayers that, hey, we went out and found $500 billion in spending reductions. And so what we want to do is, in a sense, pass that back to the taxpayer, right? So it's not just a moral thing in terms of, well, who should get the savings of the taxpayer? They're viewing it as if, the taxpayers are the ones funding the government's operations. And so if we find a way for the government to reduce the cost of its operations, who should see the benefit? Oh, it's the taxpayers, right? That's the thinking. So I would argue that the way to handle it, like to say, why is the deficit the same? It's not to say that spending, okay, let me put it this way. One way you could view it to see that clearly the government's not spending more is you could just say, oh, when the DOGE team went through and they identified certain programs that they were going to eliminate, and then that total up to $500 billion in savings, then they just redirected that spending. So instead of spending it on a bunch of beekeepers studying the impact of climate change in Malaysia, and $800,000 to do that, instead they redirected it to a bunch of households in Cincinnati who are net taxpayers. And that $800,000, instead of going over to Malaysia to study bees, instead goes to these households in Cincinnati. And so those people, when they look at their, flows of spending and whatever vis-a-vis the U.S. government, instead of them paying on net a certain amount in taxes because they got that $5,000 check, now their net tax burden went down by $5,000. Okay, so I'm saying even if you count it that way and you view it as the government's just spending money, it's just changing the recipients. Okay, so clearly total spending in that scenario is still $7 trillion, right? So that's not going to affect anything, and then the net tax receipts are still going to be $5 trillion if that's the way you're doing the accounting. Okay, and then that's why the deficit would be $2 trillion. But I would argue that's actually not the right way to do the accounting. Clearly, in terms of the spirit of what the people proposing this are, so I haven't seen any legislation or something or to nail it down in terms of the statutory authority and blah, blah, blah. But in terms of the spirit of what people are saying is, no, this is a tax cut. So I would argue the way to handle the accounting is to say government spending goes down to $6.5 trillion and government receipts go down to $4.5 trillion. So that's why the deficit would stay at $2 trillion with this, DOGE rebate proposal. But the way to handle it is, so that's the idea. Okay. But however you account for it, whether you view it as total spending is still the same, it's just they changed the recipients, or you view it, again, what I think is more accurate is to say government spending went down by $500 billion, but then government taxing went down by $500 billion as well. Either way, the deficit stays at $2 trillion under this scenario, right? And so that's why the defenders of this who are saying that, no, this isn't going to be inflationary the same way that the COVID stimulus checks were, that's what they're referring to. They're saying we're not causing the deficit to be any higher than it otherwise would have been. Okay, so this is not making the situation worse compared to the counterfactual of here's what would have happened before DOGE came on the scene. That's what the proponents of this are claiming. Okay? And so the idea is whatever you think the consumer price inflation would have been in 2025, given the original trajectory, it's still going to be that, except now every tax-paying household has an extra $5,000 that they can go spend, right? And they're not, by giving them an extra $5,000, it's not that, it's just self-defeating because now eggs are going to be that much more expensive, so you're going to have to. No, the idea is the prices at the grocery store are going to be the same that they would have been without DOGE coming on the scene. But now the taxpayers in the United States are going to be armed with an extra $5,000 to handle those prices, whatever they otherwise would have been. All right. Giving them the $5,000 each is not going to push up the prices because the beekeepers in Malaysia and the people doing, the effects of studying systemic racism in 13th century Europe, those people are not getting the money. The $500 billion is being redirected, if you want to look at it like that. All right. Let me just say a word on why I think it is appropriate to classify it as spending went down, not that and tax receipts went down. Again, the argument is we're not going to mail $5,000 to everybody willy-nilly. They were saying, no, you identify people that were taxpayers. So they're the ones. So the idea is whatever you thought they were going to pay in taxes in 2025, now that amount is going to be $5,000 less. All right. And so you can even on the front end, yes, you could view it as the government in a sense is like giving them a loan if you want to think of it like that. And then as they pay their taxes, they first whittle down that credit. And then once the $5,000 is extinguished, now whatever their official tax bill is, they start paying in on net. You could view it like that if you want. But let me put it to you this way. Normally, a lot of people, they have more withheld from their paycheck during the course of the year than really ought to be the case. And so that's why when they file their taxes on April 15th, they get a refund. All right. And I'm saying surely we would not classify the checks that the government mails out as tax refunds or electronically if they're doing a paper check. That's not government spending the same way that the stimulus checks were. All right. Or the same way if the government goes and pays for a road to be built, that's government spending. Whereas if they tax a bunch of money and then realize, oh, we taxed too much, here's a rebate of that to give you some of your money back, that's not government spending. That's a reduction in government taxation, even though naively they both look like dollars flowing from Washington, to your bank account. But it makes a difference in terms of the accounting. It's not just a semantic difference. It really does make a difference in terms of the accounting. And this isn't something special to government. It'd be the same thing with a store, right? Like if you go into a store and you buy whatever, a $500 TV, and then you're walking out, you give them $500 and you're walking out, and then the manager runs out. He goes, "Oh, sir, sorry. We screwed. There was actually a sale this week on that particular unit that the guy at the checkout counter didn't ring up. And so here, let me just go. I don't want you to get mad and get home and realize we did that. So here you go. Let's redo it. Do. And then here's we owe you $50 because that's really, you should have only been charged $450 for that TV. So here's $50 back. All right. In terms of the accounting for the store, what just happened there? That $50. I would say it would mean that wasn't that the store took in $500 in revenue and then spent $50 on marketing or customer goodwill cultivation. No, I would say that $500, if the CPA booked it the moment it came in and said, "Oh, revenue that just went up $500," and then they said, "Oh, no," and they gave the guy $50 back. Clearly, the way you would handle that is say, "Oh, our revenue was only $450 on that sale." You wouldn't say the revenue was $500 and then we spent an extra $50 more than we planned on spending. That's not the way you would handle that in terms of the accounting. It would be a reduction in the receipts. All right. Even if technically they took money from the person and then gave it back to them. All right. Or you could even get more sophisticated to try to make it more analogous to what's going on with this DOGE thing. Suppose they, ran the guy's credit card and there was a $500 purchase that the bank approved and whatever and did it. And so that was going to go in, but it didn't quite settle yet. And then the manager went and grabbed the guy and he said, "Hey, we overcharged you on that, but you know what? Here, we'll open up the drawer, ching, and it opens up. Here's $50. Gives him two 20s and a 10 in cash and says, "Yeah, so you're going to see it, when you get home and look on your online thing. Our store's charging you $500 for that TV. We should have only charged you $450. So here, just to be square, we'll give you $50 in cash." Okay, so there's a sense in which the store almost is lending him the $50 until that transaction settles, right? That the $500, the store doesn't actually have the $500 yet until it settles. And so there's a sense in which the 50, but you can still see it would be wrong in terms of the accounting to book that $50 as extra spending by the store. If anything, it would be like a loan that the store advanced in anticipation of the accounts receivable or something. Okay. So anyway, I'll stop there. I don't want to keep beating this to death, but I'm saying clearly that there's no way you would book that as extra spending by the store. All right. So likewise here, the spirit of what the people are suggesting is that DOGE is identifying ways to reduce total federal spending. And then we have a choice. Do we just let that mean the federal deficit this period is that much lower than it otherwise would have been? Or do we immediately give that back to the taxpayers so that receipts go down by a corresponding amount so the deficit is roughly the same as what it otherwise would have been? It's just now the taxpayers have a lower tax burden this period, and that helps them to deal with, whatever they got going on financially in their personal lives. Okay, so those are the two ways of looking at it. And hence, again, big picture, that's why I am firmly coming down on the side of the people that say, even if you were against the stimulus checks during the COVID era, you're not being a hypocrite if you're for this proposal, and you're certainly not being a hypocrite if you accept the check. Right? There's some people that are, I don't know if they're being serious or not, but who are saying, I'm not going to take that money. All right. So anyway, I'm giving you permission to take the money if you're a taxpayer, because they're just giving you your own money back, and it's not making the deficit worse than it otherwise would have been. Okay. Now, let's pivot to the related issue. The subtext in most of that discussion was a government budget deficit contributes to consumer price inflation. And is that actually correct? Right. So I saw people on both sides of the issue of, hey, should DOGE just do the spending cuts, or should it, couple it with this rebate idea? And I have seen people on both sides just accepting as a matter of course, as a given, that, oh yeah, the government deficit causes consumer price inflation. And then they just went and argued about, basically what's the relevant baseline. That's kind of the idea. Right. But what I want to challenge is that very premise. I want to say, in general, no, it's not the case that a government budget deficit per se causes consumer price inflation. It could, but there's another step involved. So let me, on this point, read a little bit from Murray Rothbard. And this, I distinctly remember this as a kid. Was I in high school? I think I was in high school. Maybe I was like a freshman in college when I first encountered this. So it's Murray Rothbard's book, Making Economic Sense. We'll, of course, link to it at the show notes page. But if you can't wait, just go Google Making Economic Sense Rothbard, and you'll get a PDF that, the Mises Institute posts as they are wont to do, if you can't wait. But in any event, and so this is a collection of essays, in one book that the Mises Institute put out. And number 2 in this collection is called 10 Great Economic Myths. And he goes through it. I remember when I was first getting into economics and discovered Rothbard, that this particular thing, because I had been musing along similar lines, and so it was great to see him just spell it out. So let me just go ahead and read this. So that the opening for the whole essay says, our country is beset by a large number of economic myths that distort public thinking on important problems and lead us to accept unsound and dangerous government policies. Here are 10 of the most dangerous of these myths in an analysis of what is wrong with them. Myth number 1, deficits are the cause of inflation, deficits have nothing to do with inflation. Okay, so you see that the myth, he's actually doing 2 myths packed into one with this first one. So the first thing he says that is a myth is this idea that deficits are the cause of inflation, right? So he's going to go on to explain, when I read more of this, he's going to explain to you why that's a myth. It is not the case that deficits are the cause of inflation, okay? But then he hits you with the 1-2 punch. The next clause in this very sentence, when he's explaining here's the myth I'm going to go blow up in a minute, he says deficits have nothing to do with inflation. He's saying that is also a myth. Okay, so taking the negation of that, what Rothbard thinks is the case is that deficits are not the cause of inflation, but they do have something to do with it. Okay, so that's the subtlety that we're going to try to spell out here. So to be clear, I agree 100% with Rothbard's analysis on this, and that's why I get a little bit antsy or feel uncomfortable when I see a lot of people. I think even Elon Musk had some viral clip from a while ago where he was talking like, oh yeah, it's government spending is what drives inflation or something, or maybe he said deficit spending. And strictly speaking, that's not true. As we'll see though, it's not nuts for people to say that. And that's why I don't jump up and down and say this is crazy, because in practice, as we'll see, there is a tight connection between the two. But strictly speaking, just so you understand at least how Murray Rothbard and I think about it, and I think many Austrians agree, deficit spending by the government per se does not directly cause consumer price inflation. Okay, so I'll go back to Rothbard now. In recent decades, we always have had federal deficits. The invariable response of the party out of power, whichever it may be, is to denounce those deficits as being the cause of perpetual inflation. And the invariable response of whatever party is in power has been to claim that deficits have nothing to do with inflation. Both opposing statements are myths. Deficits mean that the federal government is spending more than it is taking in taxes. Those deficits can be financed in two ways. If they are financed by selling treasury bonds to the public, then the deficits are not inflationary. No new money is created. People and institutions simply draw down their bank deposits to pay for the bonds, and the treasury spends that money. Money has simply been transferred from the public to the treasury, and then the money is spent on other members of the public. Okay, so let me just stop right there. So because of what he just said, that's why he's claiming deficits per se are not the cause of, he said inflation to be to be quick. He means consumer price inflation, right? I mean, it also refers to monetary inflation, but he's trying to explain to the public what's going on, right? When the political parties complain about inflation, they mean rising consumer prices. Okay, so why is he saying that? All right, this is quite simple. There's nothing mysterious here. Strictly speaking, if all we're referring to is the fact that the government is spending more in a given time period than it takes in tax receipts, and it issues bonds to borrow money from households or corporations or even other governments or central banks outside of the purview of the U.S. government itself, and that's how it's making up the shortfall, that activity per se does not create more dollars. Right? The outside household that's spending $1,000 to get a new treasury security, effectively somebody's lending $1,000 to Uncle Sam in exchange for a new treasury security. The $1,000, the household no longer has that $1,000. That's how they buy the debt instrument, is they have to use cash to buy. I mean, they don't literally take out currency that, their bank account transfers it. But the point is, that operation in and of itself does not create more dollars. It just transfers the dollars from the household to the government so that the government can then spend it on Lockheed Martin or whatever. Right? So when the dust settles, there's not more total dollars owned by the community. It's just the household's $1,000 ended up, left its bank account and went into the bank account of Lockheed Martin. Right? That's the idea. Now, the household isn't $1,000 poorer, right? That's the difference. So if they had taxed it, maybe that's one way of putting it. Clearly, if the government just by taxation took $1,000 from that household and then spent it and gave it to Lockheed Martin, and then there was no deficit and no government borrowing, people wouldn't say that was inflationary, right? They would just say, yeah, the government took money from one party and gave it to another, right? That's not inflationary per se. You could object to it. You could say it fuels the military-industrial complex, or it's not fair because that household is really just barely eking by, but that's not going to cause prices in general at the grocery store to be higher, cause gasoline to be higher, right? Prices to be higher. Okay. So now all that's really happened, if instead of using taxation to do it, it's borrowing, still the government is taking $1,000 or receiving $1,000 from the household voluntarily in this case, and then transferring it over to Lockheed Martin. But the household, instead of just being down in terms of $1,000 of net worth, the government's giving them a bond that has a present market value of $1,000. So the household is made whole by that debt instrument. Okay, so that's the idea. All right, so and the household can't go spend the treasury bond at the grocery store. Okay, so what deficit spending does in and of itself is it increases the amount of gross debt instruments held by the public that have been issued by the government, and it increases the indebtedness of the federal government that's issuing those debt instruments, but it's not increasing the amount of money per se that's in the community. Okay? Fair enough. Okay, but now you might say, oh, okay, so deficit spending has nothing to do with price inflation then, right? That's not what we're saying. The plot thickens. Okay, back to Rothbard. On the other hand, the deficit may be financed by selling bonds to the banking system. If that occurs, the banks create new money by creating new bank deposits and using them to buy the bonds. The new money in the form of bank deposits is then spent by the Treasury and thereby enters permanently into the spending stream of the economy, raising prices and causing inflation. By a complex process, the Federal Reserve enables the banks to create the new money by generating bank reserves of 1/10 that amount. Thus, if the banks are to buy $100 billion of new bonds to finance the deficit, the Fed buys approximately $10 billion of old Treasury bonds. This purchase increases bank reserves by $10 billion, allowing the banks to pyramid the creation of new bank deposits or money by 10 times that amount. In short, the government and the banking system, it controls, in effect, quote, print new money to pay for the federal deficit. Thus, deficits are inflationary to the extent that they are financed by the banking system. They are not inflationary to the extent that they are underwritten by the public. Okay, so if you want to see more on that particular sequence of events and understand how does that work, where the Federal Reserve buys assets and then that pumps more reserves into the system, and then the commercial banks can pyramid new lending on top of that. And so if we include deposits with commercial banks as part of the money stock or the money supply, then yes, there is a real sense in which that operation or those operations that I just described increase the quantity of money. And then if the public as a whole has more total dollars in their bank account balances, then yes, they can go out and push up prices at the grocery store and at the gas pump and so on. Okay. All of that, which Rothbard went through quickly there, I spell out in my book that the Mises Institute has put out called Understanding Money Mechanics. So we'll link to that, of course, at the show notes page over here. But if you just Google Robert Murphy, Understanding Money Mechanics, you'll get the PDF or the EPUB version. They got all kinds of stuff for you there, whatever your preference is for consumption of scintillating economic analysis. All right. So I spell all that out very slowly. Don't assume any prior knowledge if you want to really understand how all that works. Okay. But big picture for our purposes in this episode, as I wrap up here, I just want to say, in practice, the federal government, when it has a shortfall, right? So, we want to spend $7 trillion. We only have $5 trillion in tax receipts coming in. We're going to have to borrow $2 trillion. That per se does not cause consumer price inflation. The fact that the federal government has a $2 trillion shortfall and has to borrow it from the public. Just like if a corporation wants to go buy a new factory or build a new factory and they issue new corporate bonds to raise the revenue or raise the funds, let's say, because it's not sales, in order to then pay to build that new factory, that per se doesn't make eggs more expensive, right? It hasn't created more dollars. Just all it is transferred, some households who had extra dollars give it to the corporation, and instead they get a corporate bond now. And then the corporation goes and spends that money. Okay? If you want to get real specific about it, you could get fancy and say, oh, well, maybe prices are higher on certain things in that city where the factory's being built because it's, pulling workers there and now they're going to the restaurant. Okay, but then by the same token, you could say wherever those workers came from, prices are a little bit lower in all those source geographical regions now, right? But so for the community as a whole, you're not raising prices in general. At best, you're just kind of concentrating where the spending might occur. All right, that's the idea. And so likewise, if you understand why a corporation issuing bonds to raise money to then buy a factory or something, why that process per se does not raise prices across the entire country. Likewise, it's the same thing if the federal government issues a bunch of bonds to raise extra funds to then fund spending. That per se doesn't push up prices in general. Okay? However, in practice, what happens is, where does the new money come from? Well, the Federal Reserve literally creates money out of nothing, legal tender US dollars, by going and buying assets. And then that injects what's called reserves into the system, and then the commercial banks have more latitude to increase their own lending. Incidentally, in the little excerpt I read from Rothbard there, he was assuming it was a 10% ratio, which is standard in, that's the way economics professors teach this stuff. Strictly speaking, and this ended during the COVID era, there is no legal reserve requirement anymore, right? So there's nothing saying that for a commercial bank, if it's got $1 billion in total checking account balances from its customers, that it needs to have $100 million in vault cash or reserves with the Fed. That it doesn't have to, legally speaking. They still have to keep some reserves just so they don't get caught with their pants down, right? Like if you went to the ATM and it said, sorry, we're out of cash, and that just kept happening no matter where you went, like eventually you would close your account with that bank. And you said this, so the banks have to keep reserves to keep up the appearances that, hey, we're good for it. Otherwise it comes crashing down. But my point is the 10% that Rothbard put in there, that was just for pedagogical purposes. That's what econ professors do because it's a nice round number. But strictly speaking, there's something magic about the 10% anymore, for sure. Okay? So there's that element. So those two things are related though, right? So even though in terms of the accounting and direct economic causality, the federal government issuing new debt to fund deficit spending doesn't directly create new dollars and push up prices, it's the Federal Reserve in conjunction with the commercial banks that, quote, expand or inflate the money supply. Those two things aren't completely independent. When the Federal Reserve is deciding how many assets do we want to buy and expand our balance sheet, and how many, in terms of new reserves, do we want to pump into the system that's going to help fuel commercial bank lending on top of that, they are paying attention to, is the Treasury floating a bunch of new bonds? And they might try to get ahead of that, for example, that they want to facilitate the Treasury being able to have a successful bond auction. Right. So there's a sense in which the Fed can see, this year the Treasury was planning on running a $2 trillion deficit. We don't want yields on the Treasuries to get pushed up too high by that borrowing. So how do we make sure that the government is able to borrow on cheap terms from the public? Well, if ahead of time we ensure that there's an extra $2 trillion in cash that gets created, broadly speaking, through all these mechanisms, now the public is going to be able to lend that money to the government, and they'll be willing to do so at a modest interest rate. Okay. So I'm not saying in that example I just said there, the debt in a sense would be fully monetized, but just speaking loosely. All right. So that's what Rothbard is getting at, that in practice, the Fed's decisions are not independent of what the Treasury's doing on the fiscal side. Right. So what we call monetary policy actually in practice is not completely independent from fiscal policy. Okay, but in terms of just understanding how the accounting works and economic causality, I think it's important to make that distinction. That if you had, for example, if money and banking were completely left to the private sector and people just used literal gold coins that were stamped by private mints as the money and prices were quoted in, grams or ounces of gold, but you still had a government that just taxed people in terms, you got to send in your gold coins or claims on gold if you have it on deposit with a bank or something. And that's how the government funds its spending. And then in a given time period, if the government had a mismatch and wanted to spend more than it took in receipts, it could float bonds denominated in gold ounces. It could do that. And that wouldn't be inflationary, right? It would just be, the public is going to lend some of its gold coins to the government this period in exchange for a promise to get a flow of interest in gold coins and then get the principal back down the road in gold coins, right? And so the act of borrowing those coins wouldn't increase the total number of gold coins, and it wouldn't even increase the amount of claims, that a bank or something issued that were considered to be immediately redeemable that might end up circulating, quote, as good as gold in the community, okay? One last thing I just realized I wanted to hit, and then we'll wrap up, I promise, folks. Having gone through all of this, I might be giving you the impression that the sole thing you need to worry about when wondering, is price inflation going to go up, is what's the total quantity of money? And that's not correct either, right? Prices have to do with supply and demand. So you could have the money stock could go up 5% in a given year, but if the demand to hold money also goes up 5%, then prices in general would be stable. Or going the other way, even if the stock of money is held constant, if for some reason the public reduces its demand to hold the money, then you would see prices go up, right? Because that's like saying the value of the money goes down. If the supply stays the same and the demand goes down, then the price goes down, but the price of money is its purchasing power. So if the price of money goes down, okay, then it's like the prices you see on stickers go up, right? Because the value of money going down means money doesn't buy as much. So that means things look more expensive quoted in money. All right. So real quick example, just to show you what I mean. Suppose the Federal Reserve announces, hey, starting next month, we are going to begin creating an extra $1 trillion every day and just mailing it out in lump sum bursts to all the households in America, evenly divided. What would that do right now to prices quoted in dollars, in US dollars? I think we can agree they would go up, right? Because people who hold dollars right now would realize, whoa, in 1 month's time, there's going to be a massive amount of monetary inflation that's going to totally wreck the value of the dollar. Prices quoted in dollars starting a month from now are going to skyrocket. So right now I have $800 in my checking account. I don't want that. I want to go buy something else. I want to get out of dollars. Maybe I'll go buy Bitcoin. Maybe I'll just even go buy baseball cards. But the point is, you do not want to be holding either money in your checking account or actual currency. Like if you got a home safe or something that you keep just, for emergencies, and you got $1,000 in $20 and $50, $100 bills sitting in your home safe. You might not want to hold that much if you realize, oh, starting a month from now, the Federal Reserve is going to start creating $1 trillion new dollars per day, right? You're going to try to go buy something else with that, even if it's canned meat or something or bottled water, right? You don't want to be holding cash. Okay, but now think, what would that do? If everybody in the community, or virtually everybody in the community who hears that news realizes, oh yeah, I don't want to be stuck holding the bag, when this happens, they all go out and they try to spend and get rid of those dollars. So what is that going to do? It's going to push up dollar prices immediately. You're not going to have to wait for the month. Immediately, the dollar, its value vis-a-vis other currencies is going to crash. When you go to the grocery store, things are going to be a lot more expensive right away, even though in this goofy thought experiment that I'm telling you folks, the supply of dollars or the stock of dollars hasn't changed yet. But yet the news, the anticipation that, the dollar's going to collapse in a month can pull that forward, and it can happen right away, even though the supply of dollars hasn't changed yet. And the way you'd handle that is the demand to hold dollars collapsed, and hence the value of the dollar collapsed, which means prices quoted in dollars skyrocket. Okay? Well, I think that's enough for you today, folks. Thanks for tuning in. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.